Hi, this is Christian Buckley. I'm the Director of Product Evangelism at Exceller and a SharePoint MVP. I'm here talking today, doing this joint webinar with the European SharePoint Conference community as part of a governance rules series of webinars around different aspects of governance planning. This one is on permissions and why permissions drive your governance strategy. So you can find more information on the European SharePoint site and up on the blog, and I've got related content that's associated with it. And I'll be doing 6 webinars that are part of this series leading up to the European SharePoint Conference in Copenhagen in 2013. So what we're going to cover today. So we're going to talk about the importance of permissions to your overall strategy. So how should you plan, what you can do out of the box, and what are some of the permissions best practices. I know there's a lot of content that's out there, and honestly there's a lot of bullets, there's a lot of data, a lot of information that I'm going to share in this deck. And I'm going to make the presentation also available out on SlideShare, so I don't intend to go through every detail of every bullet that's within these slides, but it's here for your benefit so you can go and walk through and look at it in detail later. So we're going to walk through and just some of the experience inside of SharePoint. And I'm really going to be talking from a SharePoint 2010 perspective. However, you can see which things apply if you are on an older version or an Office 365. Not everything is relevant, and certainly some things to think about, some of the differences, the possible differences in 2013, which I'm sure we'll be talking about in the next few months. Right, a little bit about me. So as I mentioned, I'm the Director of Product Evangelism. I've been an MVP since January of this year, 2012. Prior to that, I was with Microsoft. I was with Microsoft Managed Services, which then became BPOS, which then became the dedicated portion of Office 365. But essentially, it was the team that was chartered with building a hosted version of SharePoint and starting to deploy that out into the customer and partner community. Prior to that, I was a consultant working in collaboration knowledge management space for a number of years, worked in the supply chain space, telecom. My background is primarily technical project management and product management. So I used to build PMOs and run PM and business analyst teams. I also am an entrepreneur. I've started and sold a couple different companies, one of them to Rational Software. And I'm also the co-author of a relatively new book early this spring called Creating and Implementing Real-World Projects, which you can pick up through MS Press. And it's a great book. I think I've got a slide here. It's a great book that walks you through end-to-end how to build 10 different solutions. It's not a theoretical book. It actually walks you through. And so at the end of a chapter, you have a working solution. And it does differentiate solutions that are on Foundation, Standard, Enterprise, and also Office 365. So you can go build that, and the book makes a great stocking stuffer. All right, jumping into the content. A little bit about Exceller. So Exceller's been in the SharePoint space since 2007. We offer out governance and administration tools as well as migration products. All right, so some definitions very quickly about what we're talking about today. So what do permissions look like inside of SharePoint? And we get this question a lot. People are always fascinated by, especially from my perspective, working for an ISV that sells tools that build on top of SharePoint. But what can SharePoint do out of the box? And how much is possible? And, what can I do? Well, SharePoint permissions out of the box looks a bit like this. If you've ever seen the television show Hoarders, most people have just, a mess of permissions within their environment. They've gone in and solved problems in the short term without thinking about the long term, not doing things in an organized way. And so where you have rules that are put in place that should be exceptions, but it's really the rule of the day, then you really have chaos within your environment. So what caused that to happen? So you deployed SharePoint out of the box. You didn't have any specific plans or strategies for permission. The business grew and evolved. People came and went. Projects came to fruition and then died away or were solved. And then suddenly you found yourself with this mess. So what governance is this process of taking action. It's about going in, defining the space, and coming up with the rules and the boundaries and the guidelines to keep things organized, to optimize and make the system efficient, and then manage those systems and resources. And especially if you're in governance is key, especially if you're in a realm, whether you're legal or finance or insurance or a field that is tightly monitored, if you have compliance and auditing rules, if you have retention rules, and so you really need to manage SharePoint in an organized way, then having a strategy as part of your, for permissions as part of your governance strategy is going to be critical. So why are we talking about governance? Governance is really this, this kind of buzzword that's out there right now, but why it's become important is that SharePoint out of the box is powerful. A lot of organizations just don't think that they have the time or the money to go in and spend. Governance is, we'll figure it out as we go along. And so they don't put process in place up front, and so as a result, they see this site sprawl happening. You have unfettered content, people not following rules. There aren't really rules, so you have this process lawlessness that's out there. In the permission space, it's central to your governance implementation. So really understanding who is doing what within the environment, what types of permissions do they need to have. As you probably already know, I mean, the first question I always ask when somebody comes to me is, I'm unable to do this functionality. I'm trying to build out something on my site, can't seem to do it. And I always go in and take a look at their permissions first. Do they have the right level of permissions to do what they need to do? And that's something that, again, you've got to be careful. Are you just going and giving somebody higher level permissions to get them out of your hair? Or are you thinking about what are they trying to do? Should they be doing what they're trying to do? And should they be part of another group or a role where they have more control over their environment? So you need to understand how the organization is using SharePoint. You need to identify what content needs to be secured. Different groups will have different rules. Don't treat every organization, every business unit, every team, every site the same. Think about how they're trying to use the platform. Determine who needs access, and then create the policies and the roles around those policies to enable people to go in and work the way they need to work. And it's going to help you to manage it in a secure way and meet the growing needs of your organization. Because just remember, and I love to say this kind of little catchphrase here, but the more controls that you put on a system, the less likely people are to use that system. So make sure you do it in a smart and efficient way, that you are making it clear to everybody, here's what the rules are to do these tasks. If you need to do more, then you need to change roles, and let's make sure the right people have the right roles. Planning your permissions. This should be fun. All right. So everything starts with the plan. So, how granular do you need to control access? Who manages all the different parts of your SharePoint farm? And how do you want to manage your users? All things that you need to think about as part of that governance strategy. I mean, as you're thinking about governance, which is not about SharePoint, it's about management of your of all of your systems, and that's even just from an IT perspective. What are the things that you need to do in IT and in SharePoint to ensure that the business goals are being met? And so one of those could be driving down costs. So you don't want site proliferation. You want to make sure that people are using SharePoint efficiently and effectively. So you start with this plan. What are we trying to achieve? All right. So within 2010, there are a number of reports on permissions that are just not easy to generate out of the box. So there's things like you can go and use PowerShell commands to go and find specifics around a user or a site collection. You do have a feature for admins to go in and check permissions. So you can go in and look and see from a site level or from a user level, what permissions are on that site, what that user has access to, but it's pretty limited. You can go in and write some custom reports, and there are a lot of third-party tools that allow you to go out and improve what is out of the box. So building reports on permissions, it's a very manual process. And so a lot of times if you're looking for data, you're trying to capture this, you're having to go site by site and at the site collection level, site collection by site collection, to gather the data that you need. So permissions reporting is critical. If you have requirements around how you're auditing, meeting compliance rules, and just giving transparency to the platform, because it's important that you understand who has access to what and what they're doing within that environment. You need to have reporting and data out there. You need to have access to it. So it's something to think about and build that into your plan. What's missing from SharePoint 2010 is that more centralized management and reporting of all permissions. You have to do it on a very granular level. You can't go up at a farm level and look at what is this user doing, or easily go and kind of move between, here are the permissions on this site. Well, can I pivot now and look at comparative sites, or look at that user activity across multiple sites? It's really on a more granular level. So you need to be able to see who has access to what, how they got that access. So what can you secure with permissions? So within SharePoint, there's the site, the library or list, the folder level, and even down to the document or item level. So you have a lot of control, a lot of capability. So here's just some screenshots of the permissions by site. So going in as an administrator and being able to look at and see on a site, down on the bottom right side, the site users and all the groups that have access to that site. As part of that, I can drill into any one of these users and see their profile and go over to the Memberships tab, and I can then see where this person has access to and the groups, and get a little bit more information. So as you can see, at a granular level, you can kind of poke around and get information. But again, it can be very granular, very painful, just like I had that push mower to go and capture a broader set of information. So it's just something to think about. What data do you need to see? What data do you need to have access to for you to meet your governance planning needs? Now I'm going to skip through some of this authentication discussion. It's not an IT pro session, so most of the audience may not have any idea around this, but I just want to touch on the subject because it is critical to permissions, is to understand the authentication methods, where people are coming from, how they're trying to connect into the system. So, at a high level, SharePoint must support user accounts that can be authenticated by a trusted authority. So you need to think about where are people coming from accessing your system. That may help determine how you set your permissions. And there's a number of different methods to come in. So there's the NT-LAN management, so that Microsoft security protocol. There's Kerberos. There's anonymous access. There's through the Active Directory domain services, which is a standard for all Windows environments. I had more information, but again, are your folks coming through internal users only? Do you have partners accessing the system, maybe through an extranet? Or do you have different cloud-based computing models? How are people accessing your environment? So thinking about your extranet, if you do have a partner solution out there, there's a number of different ways you could do that. SharePoint historically has been very limited, but with 2010 and certainly into 2013, it's opening up more ways that you can connect. And SharePoint 2010 offered forms-based authentication when you use claims-based authentication. So in 2010, again, it's usually for external customers or partners, and it's defined at the web app level, and then you have an outside entity provider authenticating. So, just as an example of that, you have increasingly that scenario where somebody is using their Facebook or Live ID, and I've named Google on there because a lot of people use that as their authentication method. But in a scenario, kind of how the system would be talking to the user there is, if it will come up and animate here, but that I'd like to access the Exceller Microsoft Technology Partner site. The system comes back and says, not until you can prove to me that you're even part of that group. Who are you? I say, well, here's my Live ID and here's my login. The system says, all right, I can now see that you're part of that group. Here's a token that you can use, and then you can go ahead and get access to that document and the content that you're inside. So you've proven that you're able to log into the system. So, I know there's a lot more detail that's behind that. Just wanted to just kind of, cut through that at the top level. So, how do we make permissions management part of the governance plan? Okay, we know that our users are authenticated, they can get in the system. How do we then set up permissions from there? So the first step is this is key to planning, is understanding your structure. And I mentioned this before, it's just knowing what is my site, what are we trying to do, what are the business units trying to accomplish, what activity is happening across the environment. It is so critical to the overall success of SharePoint, and certainly then your governance plan is to understanding what the business is trying to accomplish through with SharePoint, and then defining your roles and the permissions based on those business needs. If you just have an ad hoc environment, permissions levels is going to be less relevant. If you just have flatly gone out and said, okay, we've stood up SharePoint, we have 100 employees, we've given them all the equal level of access, there's one person who's an admin or maybe 2 or 3 admins, and that's kind of it, go do what you want, then this presentation is not really for you. Most organizations, however, are doing something a little more structured. They have specific requirements, specific needs for SharePoint, and so they are going and saying, okay, we have these business units that own these areas of our SharePoint environment. The multiple farms or within a farm, multiple web apps and site collections that these business units or teams own and manage. And for each of these levels, we have farm administrators, site collection administrators, site administrators, team leads, power users, regular users, all of which you may want to go in and set up and define specific use cases for and sets of permissions and rules for. And then below the high-level structure of your environment, your site collections and sites where most people are in doing their main activity, is understanding your content, understanding what's actually happening inside those environments. So you've got the site structure, then below that, what are you trying to do with the content? Do you have librarians or taxonomists who own and drive how content and libraries within those site collections, within those sites and subsites, are being used and managed? So again, it's another more granular view into how your environment's being used that you may need to go in to find those lower level roles. So think about that. And if you're able to speak to the needs, the different needs, you're going to better be able to go in and set up those roles. So first you have that farm admin group, which is not this, but at that farm level, looking at the entire environment. Define the role there. What does it mean for a farm administrator? They're assigned in central admin. They have permission to all servers and settings in the farm. They can access and create new web apps, manage services. They can do all of the back-end STS admin and PowerShell commands. They can do access to all the reporting. They can go in and set up policies. They have that highest level of control inside the SharePoint environment. So that is, now whether you have defined something that is, a subset of the farm administrators, maybe at the web app level, and give them, again, a little more granular control. They still are the ones that go in and maybe you have your farm admin, which is the person who manages and maintains the hardware, the overall system, but then you may have a subset of the farm admin who actually knows the business side of what's happening within those site collections. So right there you might have 2 different roles, both with farm level access, but maybe that sub-farm admin is only looking at 1 or multiple web apps and the site collections and sites underneath that. So just think about what those needs are and build accordingly. Then you have the site collection administrators. So these are people that are usually down in the deeper into the business, and they understand what's happening on the ground, and so they're much more involved. So they have full control over site collection, so they can go in and set up site admins and power user needs. They can go in there and change all the settings around the environments there. They can't get into central admin and from that, that upper level, but they have a lot of control. And more of what they do is around the information architecture and guiding, how the business is using SharePoint at that level. Underneath that, you may have a number of other different roles. You might have site admins or team leads, again, power users, and then your main end users. And power users, again, however you want to define that, give them a little more control over how they use SharePoint. You define that. Just make sure it's part of your planning, it's part of your rules, so that, as people are getting more comfortable with SharePoint, they're trying to accomplish more. Your end users that are coming over becoming more proficient, and then just have a higher level of need, that there's a path for them to get more access to be able to do more on their own. Obviously, as part of your governance policies, you can review and look at the activities of your end users. You may define that these users have become maybe certified on your internal system, and they are now ready to graduate into the power user and have more capability given them. So again, the groups are just collections of permissions that allow users to perform a set of related tasks, and again, set at the site collection level. SharePoint groups. It's not these guys doing the group hug down below. I don't know what's going on there. But it's, again, groups are defined at the site collection level. It's just a way of more easily managing permissions. You may set up your SharePoint groups. It's a common practice to kind of mirror the security groups over an Active Directory. But you have the ability to do something that is separate without having to go through some of the administrative overhead of managing an Active Directory. And I'm not saying that that's the wrong way to do it, because some people have a model, it's their system, they're governing their platform that way, more power to them. But there's a more flexible way of doing that just inside of SharePoint. So you can manage those rules and do it at a SharePoint level. And again, anyone with full control permission can create custom groups. Customizing the permission levels. I mean, what does read mean? Again, you can define what that means. You can go in there and customize those. Permissions are applied on objects, directly to users, directly to domain groups. Just be aware of what they can see by doing it that way. And then to SharePoint groups. So you have a lot of control and flexibility in how you set them up. So admins can go in there and check permissions on a user. So at any time, you can go in there, put in an end user's name, and check and see, as you see below in the image, where they got the permissions, what they can do within that environment. So you do have those checks. If all sites and site content inherit those permissions defined at the site collection, what's so hard about managing permissions if they're defined so high in the hierarchy? So again, it may not be an issue. If you're inheriting permissions from up above, and that's the default, that's fine. But are you meeting the needs of the teams down below? Now, by default, the best practice is inherit. Don't break permissions unless you're able to and prepared to manage those permissions. Sites, lists, libraries, folders, documents, and items. Everything can have unique security. But that doesn't mean that they should. So just make sure you have a use case, that you understand the need. Again, this might be something that as a governance body, as part of your strategy, you're in reviewing. Here are the roles that we've determined. Here are the permissions levels of these. Maybe it's that you're determining those needs on a user-by-user basis, on a regular basis. And maybe you can even have a process, maybe a part of change management, where users request greater access and controls, and they're reviewed at that governance board. But you should also think about that within the environment. Just remember that there are valid use cases for breaking the inheritance and having custom permissions, but how are you managing that? How are you keeping track of those things? Eventually, when you want to move and reorganize your environment, if you want to upgrade or migrate the environment, it could cause problems. So inheritance, it sometimes can be difficult to keep track of what's happening. So you could have copies to that, but changes to the parent object do not affect the child. It disconnects what's happening, so you might lose control of what's happening. So the problem with exceptions, again, there's always going to be exceptions, is how do you manage that? Now, this great quote came from a partner of ours, but if you use fine-grained permissions extensively, you will spend more time managing the permissions, and users will experience slower performance when they try to access site content. So it impacts performance, and it also impacts just the management, the overhead that's involved with doing that. So, oops, jumped by that pretty quick. Performance is reduced once 1,000 objects have broken inheritance in a list or library. So again, think of that. Don't get to that level. Only apply unique permissions as needed. And then the other thing to think about is how you're managing these orphan domain users. So this is a common scenario. Somebody leaves the company. They've been removed from Active Directory. That's great. How do you go and clean up and identify where they are inside of SharePoint? It's a real problem. It's not just, where are they in there? What content have they created? What sites do they own and manage? What are you going to do with those things? So that person could be, spread across your SharePoint environment. And I always like to point this out. It took about a year after leaving Microsoft for them. I was able to still access a company extranet. And, well, that was a couple years ago, and they've fixed all of that. They've organized that. In fact, several groups in Microsoft now own our product to manage a lot of that. So, Microsoft recognizes that it's a pain to go and do that. So you need to be aware of the impacts of just making a change in Active Directory. It doesn't make the change across your SharePoint environment. So check in and have a process as part of your auditing and governance policies to go in and review what's happening with those permissions as permissions are changing in Active Directory. So following some of the best practices, and I apologize in advance, there's a bunch of text here, and I'll try and get through this very quickly, but you have the ability to have this distributed administration. It's one of the things that's so powerful about SharePoint is that you can go and hand it to a team, and they can go out and work in the way that is best for them. That's what it's designed for, to hand this off to site admins and power users. But you just need to have strategy. Train them. Manage power users through the owners' SharePoint groups. Limit the members to only those users that you trust to change the structure. So, some organizations are very formal. They have a certification process. It's meaningful within the organization to say that, look, you're just a member. You need to go get somebody who has been through the certification process that gets regular training. I don't know how complex, not trying to make it this bureaucratic thing, but just think about how secure should your content be and make sure that the people that have more power, the ability to grant permissions and change your information architecture and how permissions are assigned, make sure it's the people that know what they're doing and are going to follow the rules. And so, as I said, just make most users members of the visitors groups. That's what most people need. It's only going to be on an occasion when they need to go in and do something at a higher level. And if you don't have the bandwidth to help them out to build that, if they've had some training, then definitely grant them at your discretion the higher level permissions to go do what they need to do. But a common scenario is problems are found later because someone was granted full control so that they could go in and solve an immediate problem on their own because the admin, the owner of that site or site collection didn't have the bandwidth to do it, and they forgot to go and revoke that higher level of permission, and so problems happen. Third-party tools were installed, customizations were made that weren't authorized or tracked, and so when it came time for upgrade or migration, there were problems. So that's a common scenario. So just think about how people are contributing to the environment, what they need to have access to. And of course, visitors, temporaries, just keep it minimal. They should really just be consuming the content that's out there, and really just kind of participating in the environments that are built. Stick to the plan. If you do break inheritance, use groups instead of having to track down individual users. So that's something you find that you're getting common requests for somebody to go out, and maybe you don't have I call it a power user group. So users who are read-only, that are just in there consuming content and occasionally need to go and do more, create the power users. If you already have a power users, occasionally you have some people that need more control to be able to go in and construct sites and sub-sites for other users. Create another level of another group with you can manage those activities. So you're going in and you can quickly see there's the 3 people who have those more advanced permissions, rather than going and trying to track down people that you've done one-off permissions to. So it's just a better way to get organized. So people moving in and out of teams all the time, responsibilities change, needs change. Again, you want to make sure that what you're doing, how you're managing this, fits the needs of the business. If you are constantly having to give more control to users or power users, then you may want to think about creating a whole other group or a level and defining that. So that's something that your governance body should go in there and review on a regular basis. How are people using it? Is it meeting their needs? Some way to plan, some ideas for planning for permission inheritance. So arranging your sites and subsites and lists and libraries so that you can share the most permissions. So doing it in an efficient way. I mean, this is something that you constantly want to be in, looking at the usage patterns of SharePoint to understand, how are we set up the most efficient way? Do we need to create more groups? Do we need to consolidate groups? Because we're just seeing similar patterns there, and access and control, it's not an issue. Where these people have access to. Separate sensitive data. Just be very aware, especially if you're in an industry or sector where it's important. And Microsoft has a nice little spreadsheet. There's a link here that's in this presentation that to help guide you through the permissions process, to help define, what are the levels of permission, what are my needs. So you can set up your groups outside of SharePoint and then review and then go and implement. So administrators can audit permission changes by going to the site collection setting page. So there are some reports and data that show you some of the events, some of the changes that have happened, and allow you to go in and change those configurations, change those settings around permissions. So again, while it's more granular and it's limited in what you can do and how you can use or manage permissions inside SharePoint, you do have that capability. Of course, I'm not an expert in PowerShell. There are hundreds of PowerShell commandlets that are available, quite a few around permissions activities that allow you to go in, if you're an admin and have the right level of permissions, to go in and very quickly search for permissions data, make changes through those commandlets. So again, some of the best practices, just to kind of wrap up here, planning is key to governance, and especially around permissions. If you have, and I say this over and over again, if you have an established project management methodology in your organization, use this around your permissions planning, and certainly around your governance activities, to make sure that the process of building out your permission structure is transparent. Get power users, get end users involved in defining what those groups should look like and what level of control that they should have. Give them a voice, because they're the people that are in there using the system. So let them understand why decisions are being made around the groups and the control that you're setting up. So understand your business objectives, as I said up front. Understand the end user expectations. Have them participate in the process. As I like to say, the more that you involve end users in the process, the more likely they are to accept the decisions that are made on the back end. They accept and support the system that you roll out. Understand the governance model. Understand how the decision-making process and the management process for permissions changes, for those exceptions. Take feedback on that plan and iterate. Don't just go make it, it's golden, we rolled it out. Again, get feedback and make that an ongoing effort. And just so that people make it visible, and as people come in with requests for changes or more information, be responsive. So again, you don't want to be that box in the lunchroom for ideas, for feedback that gets opened up once a year. You need to be responsive when people come in for requests for changes. So, but overall, keep the plan simple. Your governance plan should specify the policies for how to manage and use the sites. The policies themselves should be simple. Take short steps, so if people can understand them and easily consume them, then they're more likely to apply those rules and follow them. So the more complex that you make, the more difficult it becomes to interpret how to follow them, and that increases the risk. If people don't understand them, I thought I was compliant with that rule, I didn't realize that. So again, if you have different levels of administrators at the higher level, maybe you have a certification process, it's all right to quiz them on a regular basis to make sure that they're adhering to the policies that the governance body has created for the organization. So in summary, use groups to manage the memberships. Build out SharePoint groups from your Active Directory groups. That's a great way to start. The groups are much more flexible than using AD. Use role-based permissions as much as possible. There will always be some exceptions, but the lion's share of what you do should be role-based permissions. Use inheritance. Don't go and break that unless it's necessary. So scrutinize any requests for custom permissions, and avoid item-level permissions. I mean, there are valid reasons to do that, and I brought the example of even within a finance department, you may have the corporate financials that are available in a site, because that's the right library, the right place to have that, but you may have doc-level, item-level security around that, or maybe it's your product roadmap, and people from your sales organization might have access into the product management team site, but you don't want to give the salespeople access to that product roadmap detail, because the last thing you want to do is give too much information about the future roadmap to the salespeople, because salespeople like to go out and sell the latest, greatest, and then they're not selling so much of the current product. But do your best to give more visibility to your users about what the access levels are and what it means at each level and with the different groups. So try to go out and investigate different solutions for getting additional reporting so that you have more visibility into what's happening in your environment. Now, I know I've run through some of this very quickly. Again, I'm going to make the slides available on SlideShare. I'll be writing an article for the European SharePoint community blog. There are some additional resources that are great. Again, I've got another link to that Microsoft spreadsheet there. Of course, there's information from an Exceller perspective as well, but there's a couple great articles there, what to look for in SharePoint Management Tool, and the 5 secrets to controlling a SharePoint environment that go through some permissions-related topics as well. As always, you can reach me at cbuck@exceller.com. You can follow me on Twitter at BuckleyPlanet or see my blog there. And feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. I do answer email. I even answer my cell phone, though I'm never sure what continent I'm going to be on. But email, you can always find me. I'm one of those sad people that answers emails at in the middle of the night because I'm often working from multiple time zones. But don't be shy. Reach out if you've got questions. If there's something that I've not answered here for you today, and if I don't know the answer, I can put you in touch with the person that does. So thank you for participating, and please keep following the series, and we'll have more great content around governance coming in the coming months. Thank you.